What's up, founders, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Asia Orangio, and I'm the CEO and founder of DemandMaven, where we work with SaaS companies and startups on troubleshooting their growth, defining their go-to-market strategy, and reaching their growth milestones. Okay, today we are going to be talking all about customer research and the common mistakes that many founders and teams make when doing this research, especially by doing it themselves. So if this is something that gives you a little bit of anxiety, you want to make sure that you're asking the right kinds of questions, or you want to make sure that you're getting the absolute most out of your customer research, then definitely keep watching because we're going to cover it all. Okay, so the first mistake that we're going to cover is not framing the customer research to actually address the problem or the challenge that you're facing. So for example, we're going to make the assumption that you're not just doing research totally willy-nilly, and if you are, then even then you probably have still a few goals in mind of what you would like to extract from the customer research. So what I see very often is many teams will approach their customer research without really any context in mind. What ends up happening is you end up going into the research, and if you don't really have a plan going in, or if there's not really anything that you're trying to address with the customer research, then you end up just asking a bunch of questions that don't really actually get to the heart of what it is that you're ultimately trying to solve for people. Think of it as kind of like very much under-preparing almost for a job interview. You go in thinking that you're going to win this one particular role, but all of your material you've actually prepared for something completely different. It's a very similar concept. So imagine you spend the time bringing a customer onto a call, or maybe meeting in person, assuming it's safe, of course, or maybe even sending a survey, but none of the questions actually are geared to what it is that you want to do the customer research for in the first place. So if you know that churn is a problem, for example, then making sure that you're understanding how people, like what actually triggers churn, what are some of the things that makes people churn, you want to know and answer those questions, and that's the context for the interview. You'd be surprised at how many completely random questions end up on the sheet to ask customers. So make sure that your research is actually focused and that it's applied to the context upon which you ultimately want the research to help you solve. All right, this is another mistake that I see quite often, and it is a really simple one, but it's not getting the full story. Whenever you do customer research, you want the full story. You want the breakfast, the lunch, and the dinner. You want the beginning, middle, and the end of that particular customer's journey, their experience. It's one thing to ask, hey, what made you churn? But it's another thing to ask, okay, what was going on in your world that led to this? What were some of the things that you were experiencing throughout this entire process? What other solutions did you compare this to? Why did you end up choosing those instead? Do you see how it really crafts and frames a story? That's the kind of way that you want to be thinking about the questions that you're asking. It is absolutely perfectly fine to balance, indirect questions with direct questions, but just make sure that you're actually getting the full story. And that way, you might actually find that there's a really critical aha moment or a crucial point upon which maybe things change for the customer. And then once you identify those things, whether positive or negative, you can work to eliminate them, or you can work to highlight them, either one. But this is the power of getting the full story. All right, mistake number 3. Not balancing the research with open-ended questions. You will notice that in many different interview styles and different question styles, whether you're using a jobs to be done process or any kind of framework that you can use to gain insight from customer research, you would be really surprised at how many teams and founders are really uncomfortable with asking open-ended questions. It's actually really natural and good to ask open-ended questions. What do I mean by that? Okay, so to me, at least in my experience, an open-ended question is one that you're not gonna just get a one-word answer of like a yes, a no, organic search, or this, or this, or this. An open-ended question really begs a fuller response. It begs the customer to provide more of a story of their story, and also providing even more context. A great example of this is, how did you find our product? A great question, and a question you should totally ask. But you'll find that it's kind of a closed question, or it can be. Some people might just say one word. Some people might actually tell you the full story. But if you wanted to guarantee that you got a much more open-ended answer or a much more contextualized or storied answer, then you could actually reframe the question to be more open. So you could say instead, how would you go about the process of finding a solution like ours? And then you might actually get a completely different story than maybe how they just directly found you. So it's a much more indirect approach, but it arrives at a very similar answer. And at the same exact time, however, it kind of goes back to number 2, which is you want the full story. So you want to make sure that you're asking questions that give you, yes, direct answers, but then also the full story and like the full context of the answer. There's so much information in those kinds of questions and answers that people will give you. So it's important to balance out your research with questions like that. Okay, this is another one. Asking your question to the customer and then answering it for them. This is so common. Here's a pro tip when running customer interviews. Ask your question in whatever vernacular way that makes sense for that particular customer. However, if you have your list of questions, it's okay to soften them a little bit with just asking them naturally. You don't have to be so rigid whenever you ask questions. However, ask your question and then don't say anything after. Not a thing. Be silent. If they ask you to clarify, clarify, but don't answer it for them. It's a classic rookie mistake of asking the question and then giving them answers. So for example, how did you hear about us? And it's okay if you were to answer like, Google search or, blah, 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 and then you answer it for them. Here's the thing. That might be okay in scenarios where the customer might not necessarily have the language to answer your question, especially if you're talking to people who might not be necessarily as tech savvy, or, it's really runs the gamut, kind of depends, not gonna lie. But one thing, however, is if you answer the question for them, 9 times out of 10, they're just gonna take that answer. Here's the thing about our human brains. Our human brain is a wonderful, magnificent tool, device, computer, and it can do amazing things. And it does wonderful, miraculous, amazing things. And at the same exact time, it is really lazy. So if you give a customer an answer in your question, there's a really good chance they're just going to go with that answer. So be really, really, really careful about answering the question for the customer in your question. And then also be really careful about how you phrase and word questions. But no matter what, ask your question and then be silent. A great example of this in my work is a question I love to ask, and it always gets amazing responses. And it is, what is causing you the most stress today about this product? It could be your product, someone else's product. And what I love about that question is that everyone always reacts the same way. They always say, well, first they'll, and I'll ask my question, I'll pause, and I'll say absolutely nothing after. And everyone 9 times out of 10 says, well, nothing is really causing me stress. And then I wait, and then I'll hear, oh, well, actually, this is causing me stress, and this, and this, and this, and this, and then it just floods because the brain has had a chance to process. And that is exactly what you want. You want to ask your question, give it a breather, let it rest, let it simmer into the mind of the customer a little bit, and you'll be amazed at the difference in responses that you get when you do it that way versus when you answer the question for them. So anyway, that's my pro tip. All right, the last customer research mistake. Not parsing your customer interviews. Yeah, we're going to talk about it. If you are serious about really getting the insight that you need from your customer interviews and your research, you should look up, research, and leverage some kind of research parsing process. And what I mean by that is, it's one thing to be in the actual interview, talking to someone, and hearing and receiving certain information. But the devil's always in the details. What I highly recommend for teams, if you're running virtual interviews in some kind of way, or even if you're running in-person interviews, is to record the conversation and then to get a transcript later. The reason why is because, yes, you can take your notes, you can paraphrase, and you can do a lot of what I think is actually fabulous, which is actually talking to the customer and internalizing that feedback and that insight. But there's always a secondary story, and that story is actually in the words themselves. That's why the transcript is so critical. But to take it even a step further, we can actually parse this research, and what we can do is, based off of the questions that you're asking, we can identify themes. So yes, it's essentially paraphrasing in some ways. But what we can also do is, especially across a particular data set, as we find more and more themes, we can actually make this a really data-driven process too. So customer research parsing, there's many different processes out there. For context, we actually use the Forget the Funnel team's customer research parsing process. So I highly recommend taking a look at what Claire and Gia have put together on the customer research side, because their process is an extremely powerful one. And it's one that can be applied to any particular customer research use case. Any kind of business can use this. You don't have to be SaaS. And this is how we ultimately turn our insight into something that is applicable and ultimately data-driven. And it is incredibly powerful. So make sure that if you're doing customer research, that you're also actually getting transcripts and parsing it yourself according to any framework that you desire, or any ultimate objective that you're hoping to achieve with it. But ultimately, make sure that you're actually doing something with it afterwards. It's great to do just the interview and to get the feedback and to internalize that. But don't forget about maybe other stakeholders, other contractors, freelancers, teammates, heads of different departments. They actually might be able to leverage this data as well. All right. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and talking about some customer research mistakes that I definitely see quite often, but hopefully this video will help you mitigate those and avoid those entirely. If there are other customer research mistakes that either you are unafraid to admit to, or that you've noticed in other customer research processes or interviews, listen down below. I'd love to hear from you. And then finally, thank you so much for watching. Thank you again for spending this time with me. My name is Asia. You should just subscribe, because we're gonna keep talking about this kind of stuff and it's gonna be great. And I don't want you to miss out. I'll wait. I'm just kidding. I don't think I'm gonna wait that long. Oh man, so much fun. All right. Thank you so much. Love you guys. Bye.